so excited to have you here. Thank you so much for agreeing to join me.
Good, thank you. I appreciate it.
Yes, I know we were on the TheraBundle group meetup and
Yes.
we got connected. So that was very exciting. I love when it can be a really isolating experience to be a private practice therapist. And just as much as I miss like kind of the water cooler chat or just popping down to Rebekah's office to chat about the score of the Falcons game, like it's such a beautiful thing, but it's both of those things. So it's nice when we're able to establish some of these communities.
Yeah. Yeah, it was very cool. I mean, I love when there's opportunities to connect, and you just never know when you're gonna like meet somebody. So yeah, this was very cool.
Yeah, absolutely. So I love to start by asking people how they got into the thing that they're doing. So like you're a social worker as well. What led you to that?
Well, it was sort of an interesting path. I had actually worked in the Jewish community for my entire life and was kind of going in that direction. And then that didn't really work out as a professional path. So I started thinking, what did I enjoy about working in that community? And it really kind of boiled down to I loved working with the people. And so, like, what is a better people focused career than social work? Um, and I didn't know anything about social work. So many people that I met in school and grad school had been undergrad social work people, and I had never heard of social work before in my undergrad studies. So I
Yes.
completely missed that boat. And so when I found it, I was sort of like, well, this just sort of captures everything that I think that I am already good at. Like I was sort of already doing it in my life, which I think is what many of us kind of gravitate towards.
Mhm.
So I found social work and I ended up getting a master's, and I've sort of done a lot of different things over the years. I started in therapeutic foster care. That was my first job in Baltimore City, which
Mm.
was quite interesting. I've done hospice work, um, and now I've been in group practices for the past years, and now I'm doing private practice. So,
Yeah. Well, that
yeah.
is great. Yes, that's really interesting. I felt the same way. Like when I first found out about social work, I very much like colloquially TV shows, social workers snatch kids. That's what they
Yeah.
do from
Yep.
homes. And
Baby
that's
takers.
baby takers. You got it. Now, I also worked in foster care, so some of that is not inaccurate, but there are so many other things that we do and can be licensed for and all of that. So it was really an eye-opening experience as well. And then, of course, for me, when I tell people I'm getting a master's in social work, wait, what? Oh, you can be a therapist? What? So it's really,
Yeah.
um,
No, I've always said I think social workers should be everywhere because I just think like we can do anything, and there's people everywhere.
mhm.
And, our training is, what do they teach us first? Person and environment.
That's right. That's right. Absolutely.
Yeah,
Yes.
that's like day one.
Mhm.
So, yeah, it's pretty cool.
Yeah, absolutely. And so tell us about your practice.
Yeah, so I've always sort of been, my mother thinks I'm crazy because I'm always drawn to like the very hard, very sad things in the world. But that's just who I am and what I do. Somebody has to do it. So I
Hmm.
always just sort of feel like I'd want somebody to be supporting me and my family in those times. So
Right.
that's what I do. So I've been doing a lot of trauma work, doing a lot of grief and loss work, and was drawn just from my own personal experience and having my own kids to start to really dive into perinatal mental health and looking into that world as well. So I was kind of doing all of that support work in my therapeutic work in group practices.
Hmm.
Um, and I got certified as a perinatal mental health provider. And then I was like, there's more trauma wrapped up in all of these birth experiences and things like that than really I think anybody kind of talks about, even in a average everyday birth experience.
Yeah.
Um, and I was finding that I was doing good work, but I just wasn't getting enough movement with my trauma clients or my grief clients or, my perinatal mental health clients. So several years ago, I was like, okay, I got to take a deeper dive, and I got trained in EMDR.
Mm.
So my practice is offering EMDR intensives to folks who have had grief and loss issues, and focusing on perinatal mental health challenges and postpartum depression, traumatic birth experiences, um, you name it in that space. That is who I am focusing on. So,
Yeah. And that's so interesting. So I actually have a friend that I knew before, but she's the one who introduced me to the TheraBundle space. And she's been a contributor for a couple of years now, and she's a trauma specialist. And I remember even when I met her, I was like, "Oh my gosh, I don't know how you can do trauma. That must be so hard for you." And she was like, and she was on my show as well. And she was like, "Even you've said that to me before. Like, it's so othering. It's so like."
mhm,
And it's not inaccurate that I genuinely don't want to put my space in grief and loss specifically to do that extra training, but like to not allow, like for people to be able to express it in a way of like, I'm so grateful to have you in that space and let me support you in the ways that I can, but also to not have people to feel othered in that way.
mhm,
And I can't tell you how many people that I've had on this show who I've asked, like, how did you get into pelvic floor PT? How did you get into sleep training? How did you get into insert job here? And it's almost always like I wanted to become the person that I needed in that time.
yeah, absolutely.
And you're right. Like someone's got to do it.
Mhm,
And it's very amazing that you're in a space where you're like, I have the capacity and the energy for that to be able to focus and help people out in those spaces because so many people need those services and trusted professionals.
mhm. So, yeah, I mean, I just want to be that person. So, I'm here.
Yeah. Well,
I'm
I was
here.
wondering if we could kind of unpack a little bit more about like the trauma and grief process. One of the biggest things that I love about this show is the validation, the normalization that people get from, oh wait, other people do that? Oh, that's not a me problem,
Mm,
that's like an us problem, or I thought I was weird or whatever that was. I can't tell you how many times I actually started doing mini episodes where people email me and give me their like mini stories.
mm,
And so between every other week that I do a guest conversation, I do a mini episode where I share three stories from people, whether it's about their ADHD journeys or parenting or in the
mhm.
situation, right, like grief and loss. And so I was just wondering if you might be able to unpack a little bit, or like, what are some common misconceptions people have about birth trauma, perinatal grief, any sort of things that you've kind of recognized that you run into a lot with people, or kind of some barriers to entry for people getting help?
Um, well, um, I think one of the biggest ones right off the bat is just that women and birthing people still are really just timid about advocating for themselves. Um, I think we as a culture have just been trained not to speak up.
Yes.
And so I think that is a huge piece. Whether it's dealing in the infertility space or whatever you part of your journey you are on, with building a family. I just think that people are not speaking up for themselves.
Mm.
um, and our doctors, our providers are not trained, um, to ask the questions that promote self-advocacy,
Mhm.
and they're also not trained to listen when somebody is trying to self-advocate.
Mm.
So I think like that's even before any kind of traumatic experience happens. Like that right off the bat could kick off a trauma.
Yes.
Um, and somebody might not even recognize that.
Hmm.
So, and that's assuming like that a birthing person goes in like blank slate, has never ever had a traumatic experience in their life, and like all is good. And like I don't know any person who's never had anything bad happen to them, right? So
Right.
like we all go in with something.
Hmm.
Um, so I think just helping people, right, normalizing that like it's a scary experience, like it's a scary experience.
Yes.
It's an experience that you have very little control over, and you're going to go through a lot of changes, and you can have the best laid plans, but like your body is going to do pretty much what your body wants to do.
Yes.
So I think that's a huge
I'm not
piece.
laughing at that. It's more of like a ha 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 ha. Yep.
Yeah, yeah. So I think that's a big one. And then I think that again, just sort of holding space for, well, another big one is the early loss, right? So validating and holding space for people who are having early pregnancy loss. So from personal experience, I had two losses very early in pregnancy, so between 6 and 8 weeks.
Mhm.
And the first time I experienced the loss, it was sort of like shuffled off and called a chemical pregnancy, and it's okay, it's just a chemical pregnancy.
Yes. Yes.
um, and completely, kind of invalidating, and come in and get your blood work, and let's just make sure your hormones are going down, and like, you'll wait your 8 weeks or whatever, and then you can try again.
Hmm.
And so I think that, like, not seeing a loss as a loss, and not validating somebody's grief in whatever stage of loss they experience a loss in, right? Like, you can't assume that somebody is not grieving
Hmm.
just because it's only 6 weeks, or
And for those
just
of you who
because.
are not watching the YouTube, she is using big air quotes here. Just only, yes.
Mhm. So I think that that's a huge thing, really, embracing loss at whatever stage the loss takes place in.
Hmm.
Um, and and then I also think that, helping, and I don't quite know how to say this, but again, from personal experience, that, you know, going back to the whole, like, you could have a perfect plan and it could go horribly differently or horribly wrong.
Mm.
Um, like, there's not enough supports built in for when the plan changes or when the plan goes awry, right?
Yes.
I've worked with so many clients who have had completely uneventful pregnancies,
Hmm.
and preeclampsia shows up and have not come home with a baby.
Hmm.
Um,
Yeah.
and nobody talks about those situations. Nobody is prepared to hold space for that birthing person and their partner. And there's very few providers out there that are available and prepared and knowledgeable enough to support them in the aftermath of that,
Hmm.
right? So then you're also dealing with medical issue. You're dealing with a medical trauma. You're dealing with grief and loss on top of it. Like,
Hmm.
it's just a whole host of things that
Hmm.
happen all in one space.
Hmm.
Um, so that was a really big answer to to your
It was a
question.
spectacular answer, and I appreciate all of it. Obviously, as with every guest, I appreciate your intellectual and emotional labor shared with everyone here. But it's such a heavy topic, but it's so important. I just had a conversation with a client, and obviously, I respect all of my clients' privacy, so I'm not going to give much of any detail. But well, I had her fill out a form, and she was like, "Oh, this trauma. Like, what do you?" No, of course I haven't had any trauma in my life, and I was like, okay, go ahead.
Mhm.
And again, that's as much as I'll say specifically in that conversation. And then from there, go on to the idea. I love to tell people, like, we don't participate in the trauma Olympics. We're not going for the gold, and we're not allowing people to take gold away. Like, it's not that thing. And, capital T, do you qualify for acute stress disorder within 30 days? And then at 31 days, it becomes PTSD. And can we diagnose it from this book that we all have? Sure. You said it so perfectly though. Did anybody, like, you've never had a hard time in your life, and allowing yourself to take up that space of that was traumatic for me, that was an issue, that is something that I'm still dealing with, even if it was like a past medical issue, that then when coming into a hospital again for the first time after that
Right.
happened, that had nothing to do with pregnancy, like
Right.
allowing yourself that space, avoiding forced positivity. Oh, it's fine. Oh, people have it worse. That's the other thing too about the
Yeah.
pregnancy loss spectrum of, it's not a spectrum insofar as like the loss and comparing. If you're trying for a baby and you're sad that that pregnancy was not, was resulted in a loss, like it's so upsetting to me. And I could go on and on and on and jump right up on my soapbox, the frustration of how people, medical professionals will, oh, only, again, big old air quotes,
Hmm.
only a chemical pregnancy. Like, yeah, okay, you write down whatever you need to diagnose, and
Right.
that's fine. And here's how I'm feeling, and please validate that. Like, I've been very lucky in my first pregnancy loss to have a provider who was just absolutely spectacular. And so, and it was early, but he didn't treat it was like it was any less important than anything else to him.
Mm.
And then I had one when we moved from Dallas to Houston, who literally on the phone was like, "Well, luckily you weren't that pregnant." And I was
That
like,
pregnant.
okay, first of all,
Just a little pregnant.
right, and it's funny because I have clients who are actually pregnant, like who will say like, "Oh, well, I'm not as pregnant as she is," or whatever, and but they'll catch themselves because they've worked with me long enough, and I don't tell people how they're allowed to speak to me, but I will express the language that I use, and they'll be like,
Sure.
"Wait, that's not right. Like I'm not as," and I'm like, "What are we all like? I'm not as far along as that person is in their pregnancy."
Hmm.
Like so I fired that clinician because I was like, I can't be with a person who doesn't respect when I've been trying to have a baby for so long, when that stick turns pink or the yes or the check or whatever it is that pick your brand,
Hmm.
that is my baby. And if you, not you, Rebekah, if y'all don't choose to feel that way, I hold all the space for whatever you believe about reproduction. But when I'm asking for somebody to support me in my journey, it can be so invalidating. So I hope everyone who's listening to this is like, oh, okay, so it's actually okay to be sad. Yeah, because we don't participate in the trauma Olympics. And sometimes medical providers, any provider isn't going to be the most empathetic. And it doesn't mean that you've done it wrong or that you're not allowed something. That's a them problem, not a you problem.
Right. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. And again, like I said, I just love to say, like, we don't participate in the trauma Olympics. And if you can get a little chuckle out of that, great, but then
Hmm.
not comparing yourself. Like perspective is a good thing. And I don't, Rebekah, maybe you can think on this and we'll come up with a great little cliche quip about it. But like, I don't know a great pithy way of articulating that we don't participate in the trauma Olympics. We don't participate in obsessive comparison disorder, that sort of thing. Perspective is nice. It could be worse. There are things that do help us, touch grass and get back into our bodies a little bit and feel that we are grateful that at least this didn't happen, but nothing empathetic ever started with the words at least.
Hmm.
And I don't know how to articulate that in a way of like, yes, have a little bit of perspective, but not to the point that it gets you to forced positivity.
Yeah. There's a there's a really good graphic that I use in a lot of my grief and loss support groups, and I facilitate groups for many different populations who have
Mhm.
experienced grief and loss for a lot of different reasons. And
Mhm.
it's basically called the grief jar. And so it's the picture you might have seen it. It's the picture of a jar, and grief starts off, in one size, and it sort of is trying to show that the size of the grief doesn't ever change,
Mhm.
but the space around the grief
Mhm.
grows, right?
Mhm. Mhm.
So as opposed to the grief getting smaller. And I
Mhm.
think that that's sort of what you're talking about is that perspective, right?
Mhm. Mhm.
So, we grow around our grief, but we still carry that loss with us,
Mhm.
no matter how long it's been, right? And so we have to, and yes, we learn how to walk through this world with our grief,
Mhm.
but that doesn't mean that, years down the road we might not hear a song on the radio or see something, or
Yes.
a date might pop up on the calendar or
Yes.
something like that that's going to trigger, a grief surge or a wave in us,
Mhm.
that those feelings are going to come right back up. So, I that's something I really try to drive home is, that just because we think that, we've moved on or whatever the case may be, there's really no moving on. There's moving through. And, we have to just learn how to, we carry it with us.
Hmm.
And, but it doesn't go away.
Yeah.
We grow around it.
Yeah, I like that too. We don't move on, we move through. I like the visualizing of that in the jar. And I'll be sure I'll post if I can get that graphic from you. I'll post it and link it to
Hmm.
you in a blog and put that in the show notes so that people can see that actual graphic that you're referencing.
Yeah.
And also, just again, I
Yeah.
think a lot of us can visualize it. And yeah, like it is very important for us to understand and not again, it's not a comparison. It's just where we are and it's a thing, and we feel how we feel, and let's sit with that and
Mhm.
make space for ourselves. And then you were talking about the birthing plan thing as well. Like, I do understand, like, you can't necessarily change the lighting in a hospital room, and you can't, like, wouldn't it be ideal to have all of these things? And also, we are allowed to go in and consider what the ideal situation looks like. We
Mhm.
understand. Please hear it from us and from any other person. Very rarely does everything go exactly according to air quotes plan. Our bodies do kind of what they want, but that doesn't
Mhm.
mean that we can't envision the day and we can't ask for certain
Sure.
things. And again, like you can't tell hospital staff to do a certain thing that's outside of their scope, but that doesn't mean you certainly can't ask. And I think it's a great idea for people to really spend some time contemplating what their ideal birth looks like, having it written out, having some pivots. If not this, then that. If not that, then this other thing, and
Mhm.
fine. Understanding that on the day, the whole plan might go right out the metaphorical window. That
Mhm.
doesn't mean that we can't ask for things, but I do think that we still have, it's not necessarily white coat syndrome, but just like, well, that's how it's always been done. So who am I to ask? Who am
Right.
I to take up this space? And you and I are here to tell y'all, you are you. Please do.
Yeah. I mean, I think there needs to be more of a partnering and, more of a conversation
Yeah.
and just, an understanding, like options, right? So yes, let's work together and develop this plan. And what would be your ideal birth experience, right? Like, I think all of that is really healthy
Mhm.
and can help with, anxiety reduction and, you know all of those things can be very, very good. But then also let's talk about, well, what could option B be? Right?
Yes.
And, let's talk about, um, what happens if we do have to pivot. And here's how I would like to be communicated with, right?
Yes.
Here's who I would like with me to support me
Hmm.
should we have to shift the
Hmm.
plan.
Yeah.
Um,
Who's here? Who's
all
here I would like to not be with me is also an
exactly,
option.
exactly. Yeah, I mean, this is sort of an interesting way to compare it, but I think of it a little bit like when I work with my hospice patients and their families, and we're looking at, um, creating end of life plans.
Hmm.
And we're talking about, how do people want to, there's something called the five wishes. And it's literally, when you are at the end of life, what kind of comfort measures do you want? When do you want people around you? Do you want music playing? Do you want to be left alone? When you're talking about planning your funeral, like all of these things, we have like plans for people's end of life. So
Yes.
like let's talk about those things for people coming into the world too. And what does a birthing person want also?
Hmm.
So, like just these two ends of the spectrum
Hmm.
of life, like we can plan for it. We just have to make it comfortable.
Yes. And I like the idea very much of like, if we can do it for this, why can't we do it for that? I think sometimes when we can root it in another piece of reality, then someone can be like, oh, I hadn't thought of it that way. Well, I guess that makes sense. I guess we could do that. And again, you're going to run into providers who are like, I've been doing this for 40 years, and how dare you ask me about whether or not you can eat while you're in labor and how, and you will meet those people. And if those are people that you like to work with and you're willing to concede on this one thing because you want to keep with this person, do that thing. And also
Sure.
understand that sometimes some of us have the privilege of being able to pivot and ask for a different provider or seek alternative routes because it's not it's not outside of the thing for us to want to be as comfortable or as listened to as possible on what is a very big event.
Hmm. Yeah. Because if you don't ask, the answer is automatically no.
You got it?
And you really don't realize how big those things are, and
Hmm.
they will stick with you. Like there's things that I know I didn't ask for that I still very much remember and very much think impacted my experience, and you know things that I think would have been very, very important for me and my baby to have in those very first moments that we did not get, um, that I regret. And my baby is going to be 14.
Yeah.
And it's still very much like right here. And that might be a lot of just my mom guilt with my oldest kid, but I clearly, I think about that all the time. Like I did not ask for this, and I should not have assumed that just because that's supposed to be common practice, that it was common practice at my hospital. It clearly was not.
That's right. Don't shit on yourself. Don't shit on your birth plan, right? Like that, there is no should. If you don't ask, the answer is no. And I think it's obviously this is a conversation for us and our therapists, but like it's really interesting because some of the stuff that we deal with, it just refreshes that stressor as therapists. Because if
Hmm.
you hadn't been in this role, maybe you wouldn't even be thinking about possible birthing plans and best outcomes and whatever 14 years on. But because we do these roles, it is something that's refreshed.
Yeah.
And like I think of an example for myself of like something that had got me upset. And when I use that of like, well, I'd be upset about this in a week, in a month, will I even remember it 5 years from now? And it's like, well, I will because I keep using it in therapy sessions as an example. But like the answer in the moment was no, because it actually does not. And so that's the thing for us and for anybody who I know I've got other fellow providers who listen to the show, of like
Yeah.
really taking care of yourself and processing through that and allowing that. But there is also frustration, like not holding on to the shoulda, coulda, wouldas because we can't, but there is like the stuff we don't know, we don't know. I can't tell you how many times I have that conversation with my perinatal clients about like, how are we supposed to know about, I didn't know pelvic floor therapy, physical therapy existed until I got this podcast and somebody reached out and was like, hey, I'd love to come on your show. And I'm like, cool. I obviously understand the words pelvic floor physical therapy, but like,
Right.
what?
Yeah. Yeah.
Like, I didn't know that was a thing. And I am a
Mhm.
perinatal mental health specialist. Like,
Yeah.
it's just, it's just the things that we don't know. So for those of you out there who are listening, who are thinking about having these questions, it's like, yes, yes, please have them. For those of you who have the opportunity to afford a doula, that's obviously not a common practice in the United States. It's not often, rarely, I don't know if anybody covers it through insurance, but like having somebody who you can ask these questions to, who's been there, who's trained, who can advocate for you as well on the day
Mhm.
and or ahead of time, asking the questions. You're not always going to get the most nurturing and empathetic providers. And that sometimes does happen. And you can always advocate for yourself and set yourself up for as much success as possible by being confident in your ability to take up space.
Yep. Absolutely.
Yeah. Yeah. So I was wondering kind of like how you help people navigate that societal pressure, like the perfect mom trope,
Mm.
like how that kind of amplifies trauma and grief in the perinatal period, and kind of just kind of how you help people navigate those external messages and those external pressures.
That's a hard one.
I know I was like, let's just give everyone a free therapy session here, but just
Um, I mean, that's super hard because it's that old kind of cliche thing that happens that when like when you're trying to have a baby, then all of a sudden everybody around you is pregnant, right? And it's only amplified when you've lost a baby. then everybody around you is having their, they're all having their babies and they're all carrying their babies around, and it's just everywhere, right? And so I think a lot of it is, just self-compassion, teaching self-compassion
Mm.
and supporting that, and supporting, you know, that there's not one right way to do loss, and that everybody's timeline, so to speak, is different,
Mhm.
right?
Yes.
I facilitate a perinatal loss support group with an organization here that's just absolutely wonderful, and it's an 8-week group, and 8 weeks is not a long time.
Sure.
And I am, and it's for, birthing people and their partners.
Mhm.
And I am constantly amazed every time I've done this group at the transition that happens in this very short 8-week period of time. People come in on night one just, almost lifeless, right? Like
Uh-huh.
some of them are just really fresh out of their losses, and some of them might be months removed.
Mhm.
Um, and but slowly people will come and start to, you can see them kind of coming back together, and they'll come each week and have a different story of what they went to the grocery store for the first time, or they were able to go out with a friend, or just like these little teeny tiny moves that they were able to make to step back into life. um, and then to hear a year later that somebody had a beautiful baby, right?
Mhm.
Like, so I think really just self-compassion and baby, little teeny tiny micro steps,
Mhm.
whatever that looks like for you,
Mhm.
are the main things. Like, I don't think there's a magic there. I just think um it's just giving people permission
Mhm.
to not have to like rush, right? Like, we are in a very fast-paced world
Mhm.
where everybody just wants it, everybody wants the uncomfortable to go away, right?
Mhm.
We want it, oh, okay, no, we don't want to
Mhm.
be uncomfortable.
Mhm.
We don't know what to say to you because you lost your baby. We don't know how to manage you.
Mhm.
You're crying again. We don't know what to do with that. Like,
Mhm.
oh my God, you have all this baby stuff in your house. Let's go get it out real fast because we don't want you to come home and have the baby stuff there. Like all these things. And like, so what if the baby stuff is, like maybe they need the baby stuff to be there.
Yes.
Maybe they need to sit in the room with the baby stuff.
Uh-huh.
Let them,
Yes.
right? So, ask what they need.
Ugh.
What do
I was
you need to do?
I was literally, that was one of my later questions, was going to be like, what are your encouragements for loved ones of the birthing people and the birthing family who have experienced loss? And I think that is the best first place to start. And that's the thing too, is that as a person who experiences a loss, I'm not like, you know what I really need to do right now for my grief process and my grief journey? Like, they might not know the answer either, but
Right,
please don't assume that you do. Not again,
right.
not Rebekah, but
Yeah,
that y'all
yeah,
know. Like, don't assume. I love that example that I got to run home and take all this stuff out. Now, if they've asked you to do that, by all means, hop to, please. That'd be so great. How fast
sure.
can you get there? But to not
Sure.
assume, just to ask the questions, to acknowledge their sadness, to not ask them to stop crying, especially, like I said earlier, at least, oh, nothing empathetic ever started with at least. So, like, at least, blah, blah, blah. Nope,
Hmm.
nope. We don't, there's no, none of that. Like,
Yeah.
but asking and being present in that space and allowing people to take up space. And that's the thing. We all suck at grief. And it's interesting. Like, think about like the Victorian era, for example. And I'm by no means a Victorian era grief and mourning specialist, but I have listened to some podcasts and some shows and whatever. Like, I listened to a podcast recently, and I'm gonna get this a little wrong. So if already my expert, please feel free to DM me and I will correct this in the show notes. But I believe it was like, if a woman had like a partner, child, parent die, then they had to be in black for like a year or 2 years, one or the other. And if it
Hmm.
was like an uncle and aunt, somebody who was not quite in the immediate family but was close, they had to be in like or oh, no, that's not it. It was anybody. And then after the first year, they could go like dark gray. Like,
Mm.
and then if you're at the end of your second year, and you're from your dad's mourning, and then your mom dies, you start the process all over as the mourner. And like, I'm not necessarily saying that that is the healthiest way to approach grief. I don't, especially not in a day of, 4-hour shipping, would we be interested in participating in such a thing now? But there was something to that. There was something
Mm,
to allowing people the space to be like, I'm not okay, and you need to be okay with me not being okay.
yeah, yeah.
But we've just fast tracked everything, and some of it's great, man. I'll tell you how many times I've been feeling really appreciative of technology, not the least of which is that I'm sitting here recording this podcast with you. Wonderful. Yes. And I'm not saying like, let's go back to all of the old things, but it is interesting to sit and contemplate like, why do we have some of these rituals? Why do we do some of these things? And some
Hmm.
of those things don't serve everybody, and they certainly can't. Nothing can be a one size fits all, particularly in grief. And a broader therapeutic conversation for all of our listeners is like, what is it that prevents us from just being able to sit with not being okay? Because it's not okay to not be okay. And how
Right.
do you overcome that?
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting that you're talking about the Victorian era and the clothing. In the Jewish tradition, the the tradition was to tear your clothes, like literally to tear your clothing.
Hmm.
And so now, in modern times, we don't tear our clothing, but there
Hmm.
is a black ribbon
Hmm.
that is given to the immediate family
Hmm.
at a Jewish funeral,
Hmm.
and the whoever is presiding over the funeral will come and will cut the ribbon. And
Oh,
so the immediate family will wear that ribbon
hmm.
for at least the first week, the
Wow.
first 7 days.
I have chills. I'm wearing a sweater you can't see. That's a beautiful, yeah.
Yeah. So there is still some very clear markers of, I am a mourner. And it's not just to, it's almost a form of like self protection and
Sure.
preservation in that
Sure.
space, right? Like,
Yeah.
I deserve to be protected in this because, I'm fragile right now,
Hmm.
and you know, I deserve to be able to stop and
Hmm.
to just be in my sadness, however that is. And
I
yeah.
appreciate you sharing your spiritual and intellectual labor because I wasn't aware. I mean, I've heard of the torn clothes, but I didn't know that there was something that's continued on to the more current day. And I think that's just a
Mm,
beautiful thing. Again, a visual reminder for yourself to take it easy, to allow yourself that space for others of like, okay, I see you. Let me approach you in a curious way in this regard, which we should always, I always end my show with be curious, not judgmental anyway. So that's always the energy as much as we can.
mm,
But yeah, and how that can be like we've quantified bereavement now. If
yeah,
it's this close, you get 3 days. If it's this close, you get 5 days. But if it's like a great uncle, you get one day.
yeah.
And again, businesses have to keep running. Like people do certainly believe me. I have some personal experiences as a supervisor in this. Do certainly abuse the system. So very rarely is anything one all one thing. And I mean, we've literally quantified, like, well, it was just your great uncle. So you only get one day that we'll give you as an agency. And it's like, yeah, but that's the guy who raised me. Or the
Right.
stories could go on and on and on. And so that's that thing again of like, especially as the birthing people, we have this need to be the perfect birthing person and the perfect parent and like know have it all together and spin the 73 plates all at once and like especially in this grief moment like how about we just put all of the plates down just or I don't know maybe you can't put all of them down what privilege but like and that's the thing too some of us don't have the option to take any time off because we can't like we live paycheck to paycheck of course I hold all of the space for that but that also doesn't mean that you can't be finding smaller ways throughout the day to take
Mhm,
that space for yourself mentally, emotionally, deep breaths, putting your feet in the grass, whatever it might look like, even though you're also still beholden to the paycheck that you're receiving.
mhm. Yeah. And helping people, wherever they are, in that in their life space, right? Wherever they are in their ability to take the time or to engage in that self-care, figuring out how they can do that, right? Because
Mhm.
people will just keep kind of grinding away. And that, they can't do that.
Mhm.
It doesn't get any better. if they do that, and it never goes away. So,
Mhm. Well, that's something that I feel like I've heard. I've not read any like longitudinal studies on, but just kind of personally, colloquially, I've heard, when a person dies, depending on what your funeral arrangements and all of that, like you're so busy planning and the obituary and the gravesite and the visitation if you're having one in the funeral and all of that stuff. And then when all of the doing is over, is when you just kind of are left to sit with some of that and
yeah,
recognizing that space.
yeah. I see that all the time, you know, when I do bereavement visits and stuff with hospice patients or hospice survivors. You know, it's sort of like I always say it's, you know, when the casseroles stop coming. Um,
Yes.
that's when it really hits because you know, there's a lot to do in the very beginning, like you're saying. And you know, the funeral home industry is a whole other conversation. Um, but you know, then you know, people are supportive probably within the first week or two, and there's even cards coming, and there's a little bit of energy, and then that really starts to wane, and then all of a sudden you're left with your life changed, but everybody else's life goes back to, you know, to the way it was.
Mhm.
And I think, you know, and you know, those are people who have, you know, been married for, you know, 50 some odd years. There are people who have, you know, might have lived, you know, 90 some odd. I mean, those are like long lived lives
Mhm.
most of the time. And so I think then when you're talking about losing a baby and having to go through all of those same kinds of logistical things, but yet having to also reconcile that this was a life that was never lived, you know, like that I have to just, I didn't even ever hear this baby cry. I didn't ever hear, you know, I had all these visions for what this baby's life was going to be like, and it didn't even get to start,
Mhm.
right? Like
Yeah, we talk
that's
about
a
the loss of a dream for
absolutely,
yourself.
absolutely. So, and not that it's not terribly sad to lose, you know, a spouse of 50 years
Of
or
course.
a grandmother, or, you know, I'm
Mhm.
not taking anything away from those
Nope.
losses because they're
We don't participate in
terribly,
the trauma Olympics, right? Yeah.
exactly, exactly. But it's just that of
Mhm.
difference of perspective, right? Like it's just
Yes.
that difference in the experience.
This
So,
is such a deep reference. I know the show's not on anymore, and I don't know how long it lasted, but there was a show with Walton Goggins and it's called The Unicorn. And you said the casserole thing, and literally there's an episode. The point of a unicorn is like he was an amazing husband and a father of these amazing children, and his spouse died, and so all these women are going to want him because he's the unicorn, because like
mm,
there's a man who's not divorced and a deadbeat and blah blah, blah whatever. So that's the origin of the story.
mhm,
But there's a scene in one of the episodes, a couple episodes in, where his deep freeze, he's like chunking out the last casserole, whatever it
mm,
is. Like we can't even at this point, it's been in the deep freeze. And so like a year on or whatever, and he's like really freaking out because it's like
the
the
last one.
real. And I thought that was really interesting that you mentioned that, because it's like even a TV show, for better or worse,
Mhm,
articulated that energy of like it's like really, really real now. And then there's that
mhm,
next thing that makes it even more real. And then there's that first anniversary or that date or whatever it is. And those things that kind of the grief keeps coming at us in these waves, and a lot of times very unexpected. Like, of course, we expect to be sad during a funeral, but are we sad when the last casserole dish? Like that, again, just allowing like the most random things that occur and allowing ourselves the space to be surprised by it and also not judge ourselves because we're not doing it wrong. It's just all hard.
yeah, yeah. It's all hard.
Yeah. I listened to another show, and they were talking, they were not, it's not a joke. It sounds like a setup for a punchline for a joke, but it's not a joke. I want to be very clear. It's like, what do people do after a funeral? They go to lunch. Like,
Uh-huh. Yeah.
may their memory be a blessing, and also I need to go feel my body. Like,
Yep.
it's a very, and it's hard for us too, because that energy isn't coming at us as much either, like you said. Like
Hmm.
people are often depending on so ready to be there and help and support, and other people's lives continue to go on. And our lives do too. I don't want to sound like pregnancy loss is something that is unnavigable, but it is just to hold space for that idea of like, that's a hard moment of how is the world going on around me when mine feels like it's completely ground to a halt.
Hmm. Yeah, I mean it's very isolating. It's very
Mhm.
isolating.
Yeah, it's great to hear that you all have this 8 week program. So again, I love how you were articulating like 8 weeks is a short amount of time. 8 weeks is the amount of time that you all are spending with them teaching these skills. It's not great, you're magically cured at the end of 8 weeks. That's how this
Right.
works. But there are places like that, obviously individual therapy, which you also offer. Are there any other places of community that you can kind of refer people to or suggest looking into that are helpful so that people don't feel so isolated? Because again, you have these friends, and not to say that people can't be empathetic, but if you're recognizing that people aren't understanding where you're coming from, aren't expressing that empathy, aren't showing up in the way that you feel that would
Hmm.
be the most helpful for you, what do you think people might be able to do? What have you noticed has been most helpful for people?
Honestly, I mean, I think that's still an area where there needs to be more resources. I
Yes.
mean, that's sort of another reason that I've been so motivated to do the work that I do because there's a huge lack a huge lack of resources.
Yeah.
Um, I know that oh God, now I'm like my mind is going completely blank.
Well, if you think of
Um,
anything, that's fine that you can't think of.
Postpartum International,
Yes.
Postpartum Support International, they do offer support groups.
Hmm.
I think they do a lot of online support groups and they have a lot of resources online.
Hmm.
Um, and I know, I'm in the Richmond, Virginia area, so there are some, group practices and things that are starting to sort of really make maternal mental health and perinatal mental health some more of the focus, which
Hmm.
is great to see. But I just think, spreading the word and, just talking more about it, right? I think also encouraging people to talk about their experiences
Hmm.
and like you don't have to just keep it to yourself and keep it a secret. Like I think the more we talk about it, the
Yes.
more we find that other people have had common experiences,
Yes.
right?
But
I
for some
mean, like,
reason, we take it all upon ourselves and we make it an us problem, just as a me problem and not an us problem
yeah.
so often. I like to tell people like there's a spectrum of your mental health journey, your physical journey, all of these things. It's no one's business and it's nothing to be ashamed of. And every person falls on that spectrum somewhere. And
Hmm.
so, no, you don't owe anybody your story, and especially as you're fresh in your survivor energy or whatever your situation may be. And the more that we talk about it and normalize, the better. So if you feel compelled and motivated to express or share your story, we are asking you for it, please, to share it, because the more
Yeah.
people who are out here saying it, the less shocking and confusing and isolating it does feel. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yes. Okay. So I was thinking about, I was like, wow, really heavy episode today, which is great because we need this. I wanted to end on something a little more like, how do we bring it up just a little bit as we send people off? Like, what inspires you most about the work you do?
Um,
Which I
well,
didn't
I
prep you
think
with any questions. So if you don't have like the one perfect answer, that's totally fine. But
no, that's great. I think it's just seeing people sort of come out of the darkness,
mm,
quite honestly.
hmm.
Um, that's what inspires me
Hmm.
is just yeah,
Yeah.
seeing, when a client comes in to whether it's group or to my office or, wherever, and they are just in like the throes of grief
Yeah.
and they think that there is literally no light
Yes.
ever. And, within 8 weeks of participating in a group or within, a little while, there's a little pep in their step and, they're taking, they see a glimmer, right? That's what it's all about.
Yeah.
That's what it's all about.
Yeah. I'm hearing hope, right?
Yeah.
Like that hope does exist because we hold space for the fact that it feels like the world has ended.
Uh-huh. Yeah.
and that there are those of us out there who want to participate in this
Yeah.
with you, and that you're not alone.
Yeah.
Yeah. I wanted to get more into the EMDR, but maybe I'll have you back on if you want to give us you can give us a little more shakedown about I'm a big fan, but not everyone's terribly familiar with it. But I don't want to take up too much more of your time. Can you let everyone know where they can find you, and I'll put that in the show notes.
Sure. So I'm not very many places. So my practice is blueskytherapyva.com. That's my website.
Yeah.
That's
Cool.
basically where you can find me.
Great.
So I haven't I'm not so good with the social media just yet, but I'm
Yeah,
working
get
on
it
it.
as long as you can.
I'm working on it. But yeah,
Yeah,
Blue
wonderful.
Sky Therapy VA.
Wonderful. Well, again,
Yep.
thank you so much for your time and energy. I know this was a heavy topic for you, listener, for all of us, but I'm glad you stuck with us and listened to it. And I hope if this doesn't necessarily apply to you right now or perhaps ever, I hope you share this with somebody, or at least share the energy of this with people so that they know that hope is out there. And for the rest of you out there, be curious, not judgmental, and we'll see you next time on the Perinatal Podcast.